Both the British and Washington recognized the strategic importance of New York as the focal point for communications between the southern and northern colonies. He positioned his troops on the western end of Long Island in anticipation of the British arrival. On August 22, 1776, the British landed on Long Island. British General William Howe defeated General Charles Lee at the Battle of Long Island. This took place at Jamaica Pass in Brooklyn. The British suffered casualties of 63 dead and 337 wounded and missing, while Washington's army suffered casualties of 970 dead, wounded, or missing, and over 1,079 taken captive. On August 26th, General Charles Lee retreated to Brooklyn Heights. Desiring to avoid another conflict similar to Bunker Hill, General Howe ordered his men to dig in and bring the guns into range. When George Washington arrived on August 27th, he oversaw the construction of new fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. Torrential rain bought him time and prevented the British from attacking. On August 28th, additional troops arrived to boost the number of men under Washington's command to over 9,000. Washington set himself up in a trap. He had split his troops between Manhattan and Long Island, with the Hudson River, the East River, and Long Island Sound open to British warships and transport. Admiral Richard Howe, the brother of General Howe, could cut him off if he moved the fleet from New Jersey shore to the East River to block movement from Long Island to Manhattan. However, unfavorable winds and rains kept Admiral Howe from taking advantage of this opportunity. Rain continued to be intermittent to the next day, August 29th. Washington realized his position was indefensible, and it was time to withdraw. John Glover's Marblehead Regiment from Massachusetts ferried Washington's troops across the East River to Manhattan on the night of August 29th in silence. Darkness, fog, and bad weather immobilized Admiral Howe's fleet. He had kept the British high command in utter ignorance of the evacuation that he had hastily ordered. When the British charged in the morning, they found empty trenches. Washington's army lived to fight another day. After abandoning Fort Lee in the face of a British invasion on November 20, 1776, the Continental troops under command of General George Washington retreated across the Jerseys to the edge of Pennsylvania, passing over the Delaware River on December 8th. In an audacious maneuver designed to reverse the fortunes of war and restore American morale, Washington determined to attack the 3 Hessian battalions stationed at Trenton, a force of about 1,200 soldiers under command of Commandant Colonel Johann Rall. The boldness of Washington's plan of attack lay partly in its timing. The Continental troops would approach Trenton in the early hours of December 26th, in anticipation of the toll that the Christmas festivities would take upon the German mercenaries. As soon as Fort Lee was abandoned, Washington began to withdraw his army across New Jersey toward Philadelphia. About 5,000 Americans left Hackensack on November 21st, 1776, and retired without casualties 100 miles to safety behind the Delaware River on December 7th. However, the army was extremely demoralized and undersupplied, and unraveled in retreat. At about 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26, 1776, American troops surprised a Hessian picket guard, stationed in houses along the Pennington Road about a half-mile outside Trenton. Despite a disorganized show of resistance, the Germans were quickly captured or dispersed. Almost simultaneously, General Sullivan's troops approached the town of Trenton, announcing their arrival with artillery fire. As the confused Hessian garrison rushed about in great commotion, Washington advanced his troops to the junction of King and Queen Streets, where Captain Forrest placed 6 cannon in a commanding position, his line of fire sweeping down both thoroughfares. Several battalions rushed across the field to take control of the Princeton Road, preventing escape by that route. Contingents from General Sullivan's division drove General Wilhelm von Knippeson's troops through the town and seized the bridge on the Bordentown Road. Just as the Hessian artillerists prepared to fire 2 cannons, they were rushed and captured by troops led by Captain William Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe. Colonel Rall, roused from a heavy sleep, appeared upon his horse trying to rally his troops. He was shot during the battle and died of his wounds at his garrison headquarters. 5 Hessian officers and 6 enlisted soldiers were killed. Another 80 were wounded. 918 prisoners, 6 brass cannons, 40 horses, 1,000 stands of arms, and 15 colors were captured. The Continental Army suffered 4 men wounded. Following the surprise of the Hessians under Colonel Rall at Trenton on 26 December 1776, General Washington withdrew to the west bank of the Delaware River. He intended to return within a few days and attempt a recovery of New Jersey from the British. Meanwhile, hearing of the Trenton success, Brigadier Cadwalader crossed the river to the east bank, where he found his force to be unsupported. Between the 29th and 31st of December, 1776, Washington brought his troops back across the river to Trenton. He there received information that Lord Cornwallis and Major General Grant were at Princeton with 8,000 British troops and artillery preparing to advance. Washington's force numbered 1,500 soldiers. Cadwalader was south of Trenton with 2,100 men, while General Mifflin waited with 1,600 Pennsylvania militia at Bordentown. Washington faced the curious crisis that arose on several occasions during the war. Many of his soldiers were about to become time expired. That is, their period of enlistment lapsed at midnight on the 31st of December, 1776. With some frantic bargaining, many of these men were persuaded to stay for a further 6 weeks. On January 2nd, 1776, Cornwallis advanced with his British troops from Princeton towards Trenton, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Maywood with the 40th, 17th, and 55th Foot Divisions at Princeton, and General Leslie with the 2nd Brigade at Maidenhead on the Trenton Road. Cornwallis continued with 5,500 troops and 28 artillery pieces. In position to the southwest of Maidenhead on the Trenton Road were Fermoy's Brigade, Colonel Hand's Pennsylvania Riflemen, a German battalion, Scots Virginia Continentals, and 2 guns. The weather was wet and the roads muddy. Cornwallis advanced, driving the American forces back to Trenton. The American troops were resistant to the attack, but forced back through the town to their positions on the south bank of the Assunpink. Attempts were made that evening by the British to cross the creek and force American lines, but in the face of stiff resistance, the attempts were postponed to the morning. Following a council of war, Washington resolved to move before his army was attacked and overwhelmed the next day. In the middle of the night, the Americans left fires burning and marched off to the east and then north towards Princeton. As the Americans approached the Princeton road, a rumor passed along the column that the Hessians were attacking. Some of the inexperienced militia turned and fled south. Soon afterwards, the column split, with Mercer's and Cadwalader's men turning west towards Trenton in case Cornwallis's regiments came up, the rest continuing towards Princeton. At dawn that day, a British force had set out from Princeton to march to Maidenhead and join General Leslie, comprising the 17th Foot, the 55th Foot, and a troop of the 16th Light Dragoons, all commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Maywood. In the early morning mist, the British mistook Mercer's Americans for Hessians, and then for a small party of Americans they assumed must be fleeing from Cornwallis. Realizing his error, Maywood attempted to position his force in an orchard, and a fierce fight developed around the orchard against the Americans that had already occupied it. Each side brought 2 cannon into action. After an exchange of volleys, Maywood ordered his men to charge, and the Americans, largely lacking bayonets, fell back. Mercer attempted to rally his brigade, but was struck down and mortally wounded with a number of his officers. General Washington rode up and attempted to rally the survivors of the 2 brigades, but without success, until support arrived from Sullivan's division, which included the Rhode Island Continentals, the Pennsylvania Riflemen, and the 7th Virginia Continentals. The Americans renewed the attack on Maywood's hard-pressed troops. The 2 guns that had accompanied Mercer had not retreated and were still in action. The new assault came up, and the fire on the British infantry divisions was redoubled. Assailed by overwhelming numbers, Maywood ordered his men to charge, and the 17th and 55th Foot broke through with the bayonet, and, covered by the light dragoons, fought their way down the road towards Maidenhead. Some of the 55th fell back in the other direction, towards Princeton, where they joined the 40th. Most of these 2 regiments hurried away north towards New Brunswick, but a number of soldiers took refuge in the Nassau Hall in Princeton, where they later surrendered to Captain Alexander Hamilton, 194 in number. Washington pursued Maywood down the Trenton Road until he found himself confronted by the returning troops of Cornwallis's main force. Washington returned and marched hurriedly for Princeton, leaving the 2 British guns that had been taken on the field. Cornwallis's advance was swift, and the Americans were forced to march on from Princeton without securing their extensive supplies the British had stored in the town. The American army marched up the New Brunswick Road, but turned off to Morristown. The British continued in New Brunswick, now their only position in New Jersey. The British suffered 40 dead, 58 wounded, and 187 missing. The Americans lost a number of able officers, including General Mercer, and casualties of 40 soldiers killed and wounded. The effect of the battles of Trenton and Princeton were clear to most of New Jersey of the British presence. The battles also impressed upon the European powers that the Americans were able to confront the British army, and the decisive intervention of France and Spain in the Revolutionary War came a step closer. General Washington showed himself to be a leader of resource and decision. British General Burgoyne presented a divide-and-conquer strategy to British ministers in London. The premise of this strategy was to invade America from Canada by advancing down the Hudson Valley to Albany. There, he would be joined by British troops under the command of Sir William Howe. Howe would be bringing his troops north from New Jersey and New York City. Burgoyne believed that this bold strike would not only isolate New England from the other American colonies, but achieve command of the Hudson River and demoralize Americans of their would-be allies, such as the French. In June of 1777, Burgoyne's army of over 7,000 men, half of whom were British troops and the other half Hessians from Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau, departed from St. John's on Lake Champlain, bound for Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of the lake. Instead of heading north to help Burgoyne fight the rebels in Saratoga, General Howe sailed south and embarked on a campaign to capture Philadelphia. The American forces at Fort Ticonderoga recognized that once the British mounted artillery on high ground near the fort, Ticonderoga would be indefensible. A retreat from the fort was ordered, and the Americans floated troops, cannon, and supplies across Lake Champlain to Mount Independence. From there, the army set out for Hubbardton, where the British and German troops caught up with them and gave battle. Burgoyne continued his march toward Albany, but miles to the south, a disturbing event occurred. Sir William Howe decided to attack the rebel capital at Philadelphia rather than deploying his army to meet up with Burgoyne and cut off New England from the other colonies. Meanwhile, as Burgoyne marched south, his supply lines from Canada were becoming longer and less reliable. As Burgoyne and his troops marched down from Canada, the British managed to win several successful campaigns as well as infuriate the colonists. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga, Americans had successfully rallied support to beat him. In early August, word came that a substantial supply depot at Bennington, Vermont, was alleged to be lightly guarded, and Burgoyne dispatched German troops to take the depot and return with supplies. This time, however, stiff resistance was encountered, and American General John Stark surrounded and captured almost 500 German soldiers. Burgoyne now realized too late that the Loyalists who were supposed to have come to his aid by the hundreds had not appeared, and that his Native American allies were also undependable. American General Schuyler proceeded to burn supplies and crops in the line of Burgoyne's advance, so that the British were forced to rely on their ever longer and more unreliable supply line to Canada. On the American side, General Horatio Gates arrived in New York to take command of the American forces. On September 19th, the two forces met at Freeman's Farm north of Albany. While the British were left as masters of the field, they sustained heavy human losses. Years later, American Henry Dearborn expressed the sentiment that we had something more at stake than fighting for 6 pence per day. In late September and during the first week of October in 1777, Gates' American army was positioned between Burgoyne's army and Albany. On October 7th, Burgoyne took the offensive. The troops crashed together south of the town of Saratoga, and Burgoyne's army was broken. In mop-up operations, 86% of Burgoyne's command was captured. The victory gave new life to the American cause at a critical time. Americans had just suffered a major setback at the Battle of the Brandywine, along with the news of the fall of the Philadelphia to the British. One American soldier declared, "It was a glorious sight to see the haughty Britons march out and surrender their arms to an army, which but a little before they despised and called paltrons." A stupendous American victory in October of 1777, the success at Saratoga gave France the confidence in the American cause to enter their war as an American ally. Later, American successes owed a great deal to French aid in the form of financial and military assistance.